The TCG Design Theory podcast is part of the Booster Pack Network. For more TCG-related content, visit theboosterpacknetwork.com. Hosting for this show is sponsored by Category 1 Games, the go-to shop for all of your classic TCG needs. Find your favorites or discover something new at category1games.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the TCG Design Theory podcast. My name is Jay, and today I have Alex Miller with Haunted Castle Gaming and the lead designer of Genesis Battle of Champions, the trading card game. So, Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Yourself?
Not too bad, man. Not too bad. Appreciate you being on the show and talking to us today. So before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into game design in general?
About myself, I started playing card games when I was about 4 or 5. I was at actually my brother's swimming lessons. He was doing swimming, and there was just 2 people playing Magic the Gathering there. And one of them dropped a giant crab on the board, and I went, "Oh my gosh, there's giant crabs in this game. I want to play this game." And then we went down to our local Blockbuster and bought Magic the Gathering cards there. That is the start of really playing cards. From there, while I've designed some board games I never put out, I didn't directly go into card design. I have just been in the hobby field for over 10 years now. I managed multiple shops here in Canada. I eventually owned my own shop. And then because I was an owner, I played Genesis, and I was starting to get bored with the games that were out at the time. And I went, there it is. There's this thing I've been missing in my life. And Genesis was it. And so I did what any regular person would do. Went up to the owner of the game and I said, "Your product is crap." And when I say that, it was the starter decks at the time were so bad for a new person. They'd open the box and they'd have no clue what to do with it. And I'm like, I want to get involved with making a better starter deck. And I'll be honest, if that was my initial goal, I've kind of failed. I definitely got distracted and got brought into game design, worked hard on the sets and the cards, but the product design I did not end up working too deeply on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a lot just to come up and say, "Hey, I love this game, but this sucks a lot. We need to do something better." That's interesting, man. I think a lot of people kind of get started in the hobby design space and then kind of I don't know, maybe wiggle their way into one niche or another, just something that kind of catches their interest. But if you had to kind of tell people who haven't played Genesis or don't know anything about Genesis, what the game is about, and kind of like an elevator pitch style, kind of just tell us what the game is about.
All right. So Genesis is a meld of chess and Magic the Gathering. Had a baby. That is the basics there. Another good close one is if you played Final Fantasy Tactics or any of those tactic games, it's very much like that. That is the very simplistic basics of it. If just getting somebody in there.
And how big of a role is, because you say tactics and everything like that, and obviously chess with movements and stuff, given a traditional trading card game, how much does the movement and positioning of your cards weigh in this game in particular?
Extremely. So if we look at more traditional current games, there's usually 2 levels of gameplay. You have hand versus hand, and then you have board versus board. And most of the boards are static, and you know what they are. They don't move. The direction of the place doesn't matter. So now in this game, you have hand versus hand, board versus board, and then as well as position versus position. That adds a whole third layer. Because if you look at all those classic, just basic cards, like if you look at, I don't know, what's your main game? I don't even know what's your favorite game?
Ooh, at the moment, I play a lot of Marvel's Snap. That's just because it's easy to play with with kids and everything. But I think a game that I spend a lot of time on that's more just traditional TCG would be, like Legends of Runeterra, and then of the big 3, probably, it'd probably be Magic would be what I gravitate towards. Yeah.
So like when Magic, everything's static. You know the opponent's board, their position doesn't matter. When you lightning bolt, you can lightning bolt anything on their side. You can lightning bolt their face. In our game, when you have lightning bolt, you need to be in the position to actually lightning bolt them. You don't just get to go hit anything anywhere. So they themselves are going to have the opportunity to position themselves to not be in the way of the lightning bolt, and you yourself are going to be trying to position to hit with the lightning bolt. So there's that aspect of what is my opponent going to do? Where do they want to be? Where do I need to be? And that's that third layer.
Mhm. And given that the game revolves so much around the movement of cards and positioning yourself around your opponent, what would you say is would you say it has done better in terms of like giving that accessibility to new players in terms of like, oh, this is familiar because it's like chess or like board games? Or would you say it's a little bit harder to get players to understand and to really get into the groove of the game?
So I've noticed that the easiest people to get in the game is Dungeons and Dragons players. They can take it like that. A lot of players I play with, they're all just D&D players, and that's the easiest adaptable. When it comes to other TCG players, because there's that whole third level, it goes either way. It's either, oh my gosh, I love this. I play chess, or I play board games, or I play RPGs. I love this. Or they're like, I don't like this. I'm not used to having to do that extra third level of thinking. Uh, and it's really that. It's usually a 50-50. Either if they love that aspect, they're hooked. That's it. They love the game.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's, when I first saw or first heard about Genesis, the tactical aspect of it, because a lot of my favorite games, video games are, Fire Emblem, Final Fantasy Tactics. It just adds a whole new layer as opposed to the games where, your players are lining up and it's just like, I attack, you attack, I attack, you attack. So for sure, the people who are drawn to that kind of thing, it definitely plays a huge part in getting them involved. And just by looking at some of the gameplay of Genesis, I noticed that it's not just where your cards are on the board, but it's also how they're rotated, which direction they're facing. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay, can you kind of go into a little bit of that and how those two things play off each other, the movement and the rotation?
I'll try to figure out how to do it without visualizing because we don't have the in front of us. So it really just comes back down to position. If this was just that you walk straight, there's really not much tactics involved at the end of the day. So your facing is going to matter. I have a Genesis card here. I don't know how much we can see, but so every card has an awareness. It has a way that you are facing. It has the way you're attacking. So you're always going to be, it's strategically going to try to come and attack from the side, attack from the back. You are, a lot of the time, you're going to have to come and attack from the front, but the opponent's going to have defenses for that because you're coming right at their face.
Mhm. Yeah, and for those who are just listening on the podcast, it's basically like a little 9 square grid that shows where your card position would be versus where their attack range would be. And just from looking through some of the cards myself, like you said, it's mostly front facing, but and if you've ever had experience with Final Fantasy Tactics or any of those types of games, usually when you end your turn, you kind of like decide which way you're facing because that determines if you can get flanked or caught from behind. So it does add that additional level of depth, in my opinion, beyond just moving the cards. Um, Now, when it comes to now, obviously you jumped into this after Assad had already, which by the way, Assad is the creator of the trading card game. After he had kind of introduced this product, you came and played it, and then you had a lot of ideas. Um, how how difficult is it, or maybe what are some of the challenges of designing a trading card game around not only your traditional like resource management and combat, but also movement and positioning as well?
Um, the design half of it, that's an interesting. I've never been asked that question. I've just never thought about it. I just do it. I'm going to be honest here. Um, it is important because there are cards that, if you do not take all aspects into effect, they can break the game. But that's so we have a program called Future League, which allows anybody who wants to participate in it to test out like new cards before they go into production like that. And sometimes I just throw in crazy cards, test them out, and see how it goes. Right now, we're actually doing a pitch contest where we've been doing it for a month now, where anybody can pitch cards. And these are the factors that I do take into account: is why? Why does it have this awareness? How does it affect the game? What's the purpose? Um, I'm known for being mean when it comes to design, but I just like to think of I want the game to be the best it can possibly be. So I don't want no half-ass cards.
Well, no, it's good to be direct, right? I mean, trading card sets are, I don't know, like people expect 100 plus cards per set, and you know that more cards have gotten created than what actually ends up in that set. So there really is. I mean, what is that? If you release 2 sets a year, that's like a card a day you're having to create, essentially create and test. There's really no time to be like, yeah, this might work. It's like, no, let's toss this or change it. Um, and I don't know, adding that extra element of movement and positioning for me, I just, I think that's got to be a challenge, in terms of, you know, how you kind of balance that with the other traditional aspects of the game. Now, I know Genesis does resources differently. If I'm correct, you build your deck, and then there is no like paying a certain cost per turn. It's just you have a amount of cards that you can play um, as you draw them. Is that correct?
So that's not exactly correct. We actually have many payment systems. So you have a aura pool from your champion, and that's just a set amount. It's monopoly money. You start with a certain amount. Once you're out of it, you're out of it. We also, so that's usually uses all your magic, all your spells at that. Um, but there was a second aspect, which is called energy. And this is actually comes back from Assad, who was playing Magic, and he's like, I'm a big, strong fighter. Why can't I just punch you in the face? How come when I don't have mana, I can't just. Why does a 1/1 goblin come at me and I go, ah, and I get hit for one? So he's like, well, I want to punch things. So we have energy as well, which is two-sided. Some people love it, some people hate it because it's an extra resource, but it is your deck. Once you're out of your deck, you also lose. So we use energy as well. And we also have the classics. You can use your life. You can use your cards from your hands as resources. There's a lot of resource systems. Uh, the more interesting resource is the deck itself. Because I don't know if we've touched upon this, is we don't have a card limit in the game. So you could run 50 cards of the same type, but each card has a deck value. So that means you're getting 5 chi value, or they're called chi, is what we call them.
Right. Yeah. So I think you can, if you want 10 copies of a card, you can have 10 copies of a card, kind of thing. Right. Yeah. I thought that was interesting as well. When it comes, so you mentioned you have a lot of resources, like you can play aura, energy, you can use life, cards from your hand. What is the limiting factor for movement in terms of, can you move all your cards each turn? Do you move and then your opponent moves? How do you, how does that work in Genesis? And then once we answer that, we can talk about how we kind of balance that aspect of the game.
Yes. Uh, so it is a back and forth. But once we're going to call it a unit goes, it gets an exert token, and it means it can't act again until everything is exerted. Um, and every summon you get will get its own personalized turn. On your turn, you get a movement phase. It is the start of your turn, so you're going to need to plan it out ahead of time. And you can either move twice, but you won't get a main phase, which is when you can play all your slow abilities like summoning things and whatnot. Whenever you move during that move phase, you get to rotate with it. And that's the basics of the movements. So a lot of the game ends up, a big important part of the game is managing your turns. If you play more summons than your opponent, like even if I just have one and my opponent does 0, I'm essentially going to get to control 2 turns versus their 1 in a round of the game.
hmm Okay, so interesting. So, uh, you like the movements that come with the turns and the turns that come with the summons. So the summons are more or less uh, kind of like the resources for the movement as
Yeah,
well, or maybe even
exactly.
sacrificing. Hey, I'm not going to play any slow cards during a main phase. I'm just going to move twice. So yeah, that's very interesting. So would you say that with that system in place, that you have? Is there any limitations on the amount of times you can summon, or is it just dependent on the amount of resources you have?
Nope. You can play as much as you want. Um, And sometimes you do. Sometimes you start the game and you drop your whole hand, and sometimes that works out for you, or sometimes you get punished by a big area effect card, and it's managing what your opponent's going to do to you.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so I know that just briefly from seeing the game, your champions that you choose are also starting on the field. Um, and they move and basically represent you and can move and attack and everything as well. Um, can you kind of go into the differences between, when it comes to designing movement around champions and their kind of attack range and positioning versus, a regular card, a regular, creature card or something like that?
So there's not the biggest difference when it comes to movement specifically. Um, it is interesting when you compare movement and attacks, because much like this, we talked about the speed, slow, and fast. There are attacks that are slow. There's attacks that are fast, and currently in the game, most of the time, just playing faster stuff is better. Uh, I would actually say that is one of the more flaws of the game. Is there needs to be a lot more stronger, slower cards to give those hard decisions. Should I be moving once or should I be moving twice? Usually, you have those harder decisions when you have summons in your hands, because you're like, I want to build my board. So you're gonna slow down earlier on, but once you're face to face and you now need to start making those harder decisions, am I gonna punch them and move around, or am I gonna stay still, summon, and I might get blown out by one of their slow AOE effects because I didn't move. But when it comes to design itself, there's not a huge difference, because of it comes back to fast being so powerful that when we make a slow summon, it's just really not playable. Is the honest truth, and that cycles back to uh, the speed of the game where it's at is where the swift stuff is just really powerful right now. And as we're going forward, we're trying to balance that out, make a lot more stronger slow stuff.
Right. Which makes sense. I mean, you could play test the game for thousands of hours yourself, but then as soon as, you get into the hands of 50 people, they're going to be play testing it, way more than you ever would and find all kinds of things. And so, yeah, that's interesting. And I've heard plenty of examples of people who or designers who have run into that where they really like a certain aspect of the game. They want it to be more utilized, but players are obviously going to the thing that's going to win them the game and things like that.
Yes, very much. I want to touch up on that. I 100% agree with this. This is actually I sometimes have to fight Assad with this. Is Assad had a vision when he made the game, and it actually doesn't matter your like my vision, Assad's vision. It only matters how the players play the game. And one of the arguments I had to have with Assad is the game. It comes back to those three things. I was like, the game isn't just a board, and Assad was deep about the board and the movement and that. He's like, this is what makes Genesis great, and I said yes, but it isn't just the board. There is hand to hand knowledge. You need to know these things, and you need to make cards that play that as well. Specifically because there's cards already in existence that just do those things. When you play a card that just says gain 4 life, that's very hard to interact on the board. So the only way for an opponent to play against that is something that stops that from across the board.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, that's you you have one expectation for a game or a design or even a specific card, and you're like, oh, this is what this is going to do, and then players are like, oh, actually, this is awesome. I'm going to do it this way, and you're like, no, 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 wait, wait, that's not what I meant. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. So touching on champions because they're the kind of central part of your deck and I assume like the strategy that you're using. Do champions really have an effect on how the pace at which someone plays? Because you
Oh,
said that they're
extremely. Um, but I say extremely, but it depends on the champions. Like there's some very aggressive champions, and there's some very slow champions. Then I guess you have the middle point. But if you're playing an aggressive opponent, you need to figure out whether they're going to rush you down and you need to build a defense, or it's essentially a ruse. You're used to this champion being a quick thing, and you actually need to get into their face, and they're playing a slow, dirtily build up deck on the other side of the board.
Yeah, that's interesting because I did hear a few things about what some of the different champions did, and I can't remember the champion's name, but I know there's like some version of like teleporting in the game.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you kind of go into that as well in terms of a game mechanic?
Okay, I'll go into it. It's not going to be as exciting as you want because it is a mechanic that we will not. I don't think you'll see much of it in the future. It is an alpha mechanic. It was a mechanic before I was a game designer, but I truly believe it breaks the core of the game, which is movement and positioning. Now, it's luckily gone away. There used to be an aggressive deck where it's like teleport behind my opponent, kill them. But now there's enough good enough defense cards that that doesn't happen no more, and you actually get to play the game. Thank God we're away from alpha and beta anymore. But uh, yeah, so it's like positioning yourself against your opponent's position. For me, that's such a core beauty of a tactical game with a board. If you get to go around that, it's a little rough. It's essentially taking out a beautiful aspect of the game.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when I heard about the teleporting, I was like, I don't. That seems like a really hard thing to balance with design in terms of like this game is based around movement, and this mechanic is basically just like I can move easier than everybody else. So, um, yeah, no, that's very interesting. So in terms of each champion kind of having kind of I guess creating this different pace that players take where it's like, hey, I know this champion is tends to be faster, so I need to react that way, even though my champion may be a little bit slower. Um, in terms of the presence of your champions on the board and how they move and how they interact, um, I know movement's not just about combat, but it's also about support and things like that. How where do those how do you design mechanics around those types of things in terms of your positioning and everything?
Usually, it's based on. I want to say it's a reward system, but I don't know if that's the right term. A reward in the sense when you play a card right by being in the right position is the best way to design like that. Where if there's cards that allow you to defend, protect without you being in a good position, realistically, that's kind of bad design. It's like the player is going to play the cards you design, and rather than them strategically being in the right place, uh, and their opponent, you know, doesn't get a chance to outplay that as well, where both sides has a chance to outplay a card, I think is the best for design.
Right. And so with as you described, it was like, I move and then my opponent moves, based on the turns that you have and everything like that. Um, you know, do you often run into situations where you have two players who are just kind of trying to evade each other? Like they're just kind of skirting around, themselves and the objectives and like, oh, I'm not gonna hit first, you're not gonna hit first. Let's see who starts this whole thing.
So I will say not enough players do this, not even in the slightest. I'm known to run away like a chicken, and I will do it on purpose, and then I'll come back and win. But a lot of people, they just keep going at it until they die, and I think that's more of a player thing. But 100%, they should be doing it more.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting that you put it that way because it reminds me of people who like first get into like MOBAs, right? It's like they push these lanes, and it's like, oh, hey, when you're in trouble, you need to back away. There's no benefit to tanking, and just dying, right? Especially in this game, you die, you're done. Um, so you're the lead designer. You're seeing players do this thing. One of the things you can do as a designer is maybe kind of change some things in the game to make that more of a thing. Because as you said, players, all that matters is what the players do, how they're playing the game. Is there anything that you feel like you can do with movement that kind of pushes players in that direction of like, hey, it's okay to use the whole board and to retreat and to use your positioning wiser?
Definitely. There's no. 100% yes. As a designer, you can realistically when we start a set, we usually have goals. So coming out of our last set, we had Origins release some while ago. The meta before that was just you just played all offensive, zero defensive cards. You charged at your opponent. You either killed them or they killed you. And when we hit him into Origins, I was like, we're putting good defensive cards in. And just because before I came, defensive cards would always be outrated by offensive cards. It'd be like, this card does 3 damage for the exact same cost. We made a defensive card. It prevents 2 damage. It's like,
Right.
why? So there wasn't a proper balance of offense to defense, and that's the same with mobility. Certain colors had access to better mobility, so they were able to push in specific ways.
And is there currently any mechanics in the game that kind of reward, or maybe not reward, but play off of a like a hit and run type of gameplay style? Like, hey, I'm going to come in and strike you, and then kind of back up to a safe distance.
There is not. There is. I can say coming soon. You will see more of that. That was one of the things I'm pushing for an upcoming set. There are very few champions who can do it, or if you build that strategy, you can do it. Specific champion. I think the better answer there is yes, but only for specific champions, not as a generic style of strategy for all champions.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You have the champions that are going to be up in your face, the ones that are more laid back and defensive. But yeah, I can imagine it's a bit harder to design, a champion that's going to go up, get into the mix, and then kind of fall back. Um, well, kind of shifting gears a little bit with the movement being such a huge part of this game, compared to other traditional trading card games. What does this do for the length of a game? I know a lot of times in competitive scenes, there's like a match where you got to go in 2 out of 3. What is the game length end up looking like depending on player strategies?
It is so dramatic based on the strategy. If you have 2 Dirtle decks come against each other, I will say the game can take long. Same thing if you have 2 offensive decks going against each other, it goes really fast. If you get the middle, it's not long at all. It's a good balance. But the double Dirtle decks, it's a slog, but not in a bad way. The double Dirtle decks are usually actually the best to watch because there's so much strategy. Both people have created such a beautiful board, so every single piece, when it moves, every other piece is going to, you have to think about where that piece is moving as well.
Yeah, and it's just this constant like I react and you react and I react instead of it being this big swings, I guess, essentially. Um, Now, has there been any thoughts behind, the I don't want to sound like, battle royale here or anything, but like decreasing like the areas of the board that are accessible after a certain amount of rounds or anything like that to make it to where players have to engage with each other?
So let's say as a core mechanic of the current game, no. So as a player, there are cards that just do that. There are cards that block off spaces on the boards, so you can just run those in your deck if that was part of your strategy to lock people out of specific areas. I can't say that you'll never see that in the future as a game mechanic within the game, but usually that's not a big issue. Most players get into faces pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you want to jump right into the action. That's just the exciting part, right? So, and thankfully that is the case most of the time. And I'm kind of curious with the positioning and you saying cards locking out certain spots and things like that. Have you ever run into situations where you had a player do something or build a deck that was revolved around just locking their champion away to where they couldn't be like, I'm just going to keep him here. He can't go anywhere. You can't get to him. Anything like that. Just kind of like a player that freezes other people out.
There is a singular deck. I unfortunately made it. Nobody saw it. Nobody saw it. And it was a surprise, and everybody had been. It hasn't been brought again recently. I haven't seen people play it in a while. But yes, there was a deck at a time. There's a card that says while you're on it, you can't be targeted. But also while you're on it, you can't play cards. Now, it's supposed to be. It was designed to be a defensive card. But what if I put it on you and then block the movement around you, so you just couldn't play cards? Now, it's a very bad strategy because if they can just kill something that blocks the path in response, you've done all your resources and they just walk out. But when people did not expect this, it was great just to see their mouth drops and be like, huh.
Yeah, didn't see that coming. Yeah. Um, yeah, and so doing that to your opponent, yeah, that's definitely uh, an interesting thing to try and lock them out. But I didn't know if any of these like defensive players maybe were like, "Hey, I'm just gonna like protect my champion as best I can and like keep him in one place while everybody else kind of fights and everything." Do you have a lot of examples of that, or are there a lot of viable strategies around like kind of walling off?
I would say they have never been viable. Just the resource output you put into playing defensive cards while your opponent is putting resources into offensive cards is just the offensive cards are now going to get to do damage more than once. Well, that defensive card is just a stabilizer. It just sat there and did nothing for your winning the game strategy.
With the mechanics that you guys have designed with this movement and positioning and everything in mind, taking all these factors into consideration beyond, okay, how much does this card cost, how much, how powerful is it, you also got to consider the range, their movement, and other things like that. um, how do you guys how do you guys view the way that this type of mechanic is handled in other games? Are there examples of other games that you guys have maybe got inspired by, or that think they do it like a different way, but maybe interesting? Is there any of that that you've seen in recent years?
100%. And I actually usually tell the designers to do this. And not even just card games. I say, what's your favorite comic book moment? What's your favorite movie moment? Take whatever that is and design that. Um, Whatever, sparks passion in you, whatever is exciting, whatever is energy, you should be borrowing that from, I would say, borrowing it, take it, whatever it is, and bring that experience. If that's a positive experience anywhere else, we want to bring that to the players. You should be bringing any chance you can of positive experiences to other people.
hmm And so, what are some examples of games that use movement and positioning well in your mind that maybe that you guys
Ooh.
like I said took some inspiration from, or something that caught your interest even before Genesis?
Specifically movement. Ooh, that's a rough one. Like the basic easy one is chess, right? Because there's pieces on the board. You have all these unique pieces. They move uniquely. That's the simplistic one. Other forms of movement. When it comes to TCGs, you don't get much. Um, so you're actually better to start looking into the video game genre to go into movement because people are used to controlling pieces. Looking at World of Warcraft, all those different classes usually have some sort of movement ability, whether it's teleporting, whether it's charging an enemy, something like that. Go into the video game space because when you're playing a character in the video game space, you're always moving. A lot of games, whether they're like even like 2-bit games, you usually have to like evade attacks or move something. Sometimes there's a dash. Sometimes there's all these slight movement things.
Right. And so I'll bring up an example of a card game that does something similar, which is Sorcery TCG. I don't know how familiar you are with their mechanics, but given how they kind of handle movement on the board, can you kind of go into that a little bit of you know, what some of the differences between a system like that is versus the system that Genesis uses?
So this comes back to the unfortunately directional really doesn't matter in sorcery too much. I will say I played it twice when they were like in the very beginning when they were like practicing testing stuff. So I don't have that much experience. And then the next part is your board doesn't. The board's not there. You have to build the board to move across, which is another big thing. Which is I like their flavor. I don't like it from a tactical aspect because there's only really one way to build. You're going to build forward or left or right. Um, Realistically, I don't got much else to say. Uh,
Understanding that that's a major difference between, your game and their game in terms of you both use a uh, a grid of sorts, but they're building the lands that they can hop across, whereas your land is already there essentially. Now, if we look at it from the opposite perspective of, um, there's not necessarily a grid or a board, but there is a central point that people are placing cards around. Um, so maybe the cards aren't moving, but the position of where you place your cards kind of matters. Is that something that you've seen implemented in anything like that in the trading card game space before?
so when I look at games with spacing, there's very little in. You got chaotic, which was where you would preset your units, but then those back units would be able to move and attack specific spots. But even then, it wasn't the movement wasn't that big as part of the strategy. From there, there's not much. There's some older games. I can't remember them. Sid would be able to call them because he played them and he got inspiration from them, right?
Mhm.
But I don't have that much, unfortunately.
Gotcha. So yeah, let's kind of dive into that a bit because you have games, and I haven't played much of Gwent, for instance, but I know like Gwent, for instance, has like your front row, back row. I think you like your back row. I don't know what it's called, like the siege row. Um, what examples can you think of that do positioning like that, to where you're not necessarily moving cards, in a tactical way, but just kind of positioning more so in a tactical way?
The positioning of layers. So there was a game that Bandai tried to put out a couple years ago. I'm going to say 5 years ago. Dragon something. Dragonborn? Dragonborn.
That sounds like it'd be it.
Yeah, I hope maybe it's not. Where you, uh, it's actually very similar to Cryptic, where you sort of had a back row of resources, but they themselves could be creatures. So you set up front your front line, but then when they got hit, they would also transform, come out, and do things. So there's that formation. When it comes to Gwent, Gwent is really okay. I play Gwent very little, but I did play Gwent on Witcher 3, and I'm trying to remember it. I'm trying to remember if it was you would be playing your position based off what your opponent played. It was more of like they played this, I will strategically play this just to counter that sort of style. And then we know obviously Yu-Gi-Oh has a front row, back row, trap cards, spell cards. But at that point, it's not really about movement. It's really hard to, I think, find a lot of these movement games. I don't think there's a lot.
Not a lot that probably do it well, because I know that Yu-Gi-Oh, for instance, did link summons, which it's like I have an arrow that points to where you can go and all that. But they did that, I think, in terms of trying to solve their special summoning problem, because people would just turn one just dump a bunch of crap onto the board, um, and it's just like, oh my god, you just get overwhelmed. I mean, you still get that, but I think it's limited to a certain extent. Um, but yeah, no, I think a lot of what you see is there's not a lot of games that have movement where your cards are moving on a board or a grid. You have positioning that matters in a lot of games. Like adjacent cards get +1 bonus, or things like that. Um, and I know that there was a game, I can't remember the name of it, but it was, your card would take an action, then it would rotate, and then it would take another action the next turn, and then rotate, and then take another action. I think it was Light Seekers.
Light Seekers, but that when they rotated, it was their effects would change, right? Was realistically the goal of it.
Yeah, and so you have things like that where your cards are, again, in a different position of sorts. And if you want to go as basic as possible, you can say Yu-Gi-Oh does the attack and defense. Sure, but every game has, I think, a level of positioning of the cards to it. Now, the difference between positioning and movement. Um, is there a small gap there to where like some movement can be done, but not to the extent of what Genesis does, or is it like, hey, if you're gonna move cards, you got to move cards?
Yes, I don't know. Genesis itself has that issue too. I can say, but we've gotten around that with specific ways. Like when you look at a lot of classic games, like you look at Magic the Gathering and you put enchantments, it's easy to just put a card underneath the guy because he's not moving. But when you have to keep moving all those cards and you have multiple enchantments on them, it gets very clunky. So you just keep them off the side of the board. It's much easier, uh, and that's I think the big difference when it comes to other card games. Um, a lot of the time, though, a lot of those games just they aren't built for that. Why would they need to move? That's it. Um, I'm thinking Hearthstone had some positional stuff as well, like left or right once again, but it just comes down to a lot of those cards, those games not built for movement. I don't think it's not needing. I think we should say not built for movement. It was not designed that way. They might be able they can add in those effects that are like, oh, the card to the left, the card to the right, but that's about it.
And so, would you say that the major difference then between a traditional trading card game versus a game like Genesis is simply the fact that the cards are moving and they're moving on a space that has been predetermined? Would you say that that's kind of the big difference there? Because every game.
I would say that's definitely a big difference. I think, and that next step too is there's movement, and then specifically the directional as well is a huge secondary thing as well. That's just the next level, right? Moving's one thing, and then being able to turn. A lot of these games you can't do that because they use tapping or defense mode as a terminology, right? The changing of position means something else. If you were to do that in Genesis, like if you were to turn, you'd be facing the wrong way.
Right, exactly. So, and not only that, but you have movement, you have turning, you have attack range, and if I'm not mistaken, I think some of your action cards or spell cards need to, um, again, to use them, be within range of a specific unit or your champion. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Right. So positioning in the direction you're facing and where you're at on the board is huge. So thinking of a game of Genesis and thinking of how the grid is laid out and people obviously kind of rushing towards each other a lot of the times and I assume the middle of the board obviously gets a lot of action. What are you guys noticing about the sides of the board? Is there a lot of stuff going on there to where players are utilizing kind of those outward edges of the play space?
Usually, when you if you meet in the middle, because you naturally want to attack from the side, you're going to go to one of the sides to attack there, and then there's going to be a shift to turn to one of the sides. I'd say that's the probably more the most common about using the edges.
Hmm. Just when those rotations happen, essentially when you're trying to get around your opponent.
Or I guess the secondary places. If your opponent's an aggressor, realistically, the best defensive move you can do on your first turn is immediately go to the right, and you're going to build your defenses on the right side or the left side. This realistically, there's no difference. It's an equal size board, but and then you build on that one side, and the opponent's going to have to funnel towards that side for you. That'd be the secondary place where I think is a common to play along the walls.
Interesting. So with the topic in mind of just movement and positioning in general, as the lead designer of Genesis and looking at what you have currently, what you've had, where you've come from, and where you want to go, what do you feel, given this specific mechanic, are some of the biggest frustrations you have? And then some of the biggest, I guess, freeing feelings you have of like, yes, this is great because we have movement, because it's so centered around this, we can do these cool things versus, oh, because we have movement, I can't do this because it's so frustrating to like balance and get it right.
Interesting. Okay, I can answer the second one easier. The It's just if you watch a game of Genesis with two sort of pro, we'll call them pros. We'll just say it's beautiful. It's a dance. You see, because they know what they're doing. It's movement. They do their thing. Movement. They do their thing. And you're just watching this. It's beautiful. And you see these beautifully placed strategic cards go down and maneuvering and outmaneuvering. It's just beautiful to watch. When it comes to designing what is difficult about the movement, okay, it's sort of what I talked about a little bit earlier, where I said there's the board, there's the me fighting you, and then there's the hand to hand. It's the hand to hand that is the biggest stuff. Specifically, that cards were designed in the past, specifically alpha, beta, that affect the game where you can't react because you start on the opposite side of the board. That's the biggest challenge. It wasn't looked at in that sense, that these cards are essentially, you can't play against them from turn one because you're across the board. That would be the biggest thing. Once you get into the thick of it, I don't think there's much. Once you're in face to face, I think it's fair game. Everybody can do. You could have built your deck any way you wanted to, strategy wise. Now looking at designs for the game, it's understanding that a certain card could be designed and is useless unless it's in a very specific position of the game. I think that's a good one. I like to call out people for that. I think it's also sort of one of our models, or at least one of my models, is when we're designing a set nowadays, I do not want to see a unplayable card even in the common slot. I think too many card games make cards that they're just unplayable. Assad will fight me about one thing. He doesn't want to make unplayable cards, but he wants to play vanilla card. He wants vanilla cards in a set because he's like, new players need vanilla cards. And I don't believe that to be true. I don't think that if I make a 1/1, or if I make a 1/1 that, let's just say, gets an extra movement, that a new player is going to be like, oh, I wish this was a 1/1. They're never going to say that.
Yeah, so that is an interesting perspective though, because a lot of card games do add those vanilla cards because it's like, oh yeah, this is just it's pretty straightforward. This is it, and with the added layer of movement, so even then, you don't think that cards need to be vanilla. They should always have something that they can do, some kind of ability.
So okay, that's not necessarily true. You can make a very good vanilla cards, just like it has no special ability, but then it has a cool how it can attack, like a weird awareness to its range or something like that. When you look at it, it's a very vanilla card because there's no extra text on its body, but like the core of it, it's simplistic. My issue is going set after set with vanilla cards in them. I think that's my core issue. Once a player's learned the game, they never play a vanilla card. That's it. I know Yu-Gi-Oh! Is trying to get around this by making Vanillas Matters cards and stuff like that. It's funny, but at the end of the day, I feel like you're just trying to push that you've made bad cards, so you've made one card that makes your bad cards good, rather than just making good cards to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this is off the topic of movement, but you kind of mentioned as the players learn the game and as sets are released, players aren't going to use vanilla cards. How do you kind of approach that philosophy from the new player perspective? As your game has been out for a while, do you guys try to do set rotations? Do you guys do anything like that, or is like ban lists? How do you make it to where players that are jumping in maybe on a recent set aren't getting overwhelmed with all the options and mechanics they have?
For sure. So I'll go down the list. There is one card banned in Genesis. It was banned in Alpha. So the amount of players that even have the card is so limited. Maybe like 20 players own the card. It was banned in Alpha. And personally, I would unban it if it didn't mean that I'd have to reprint it. And I don't want to waste the card slot just to do it. We have one restricted card, which is it's the only card that's restricted in the game, and it's down to 4. And this is the epitome of what I was just complaining about. It does something from across the board, and your opponent can't interact with it. And it's just draw a couple cards. It's draw 3 cards. Well, if you have an unlimited amount of this in your deck, you just get to draw through your deck. So, now, if I just say it like that, it's very simple. There's more cost to it. Obviously, it has a resource cost and a deck building cost. It has the highest deck building cost. But regardless, smart people just came along and said, I can math this. I have enough to instantly kill anybody anywhere on the board. And when you have math involved, it's, there's no lie to it. You can literally do the calculations.
Yeah, when someone busts out a spreadsheet, you just got to run away. Like, you don't want to play that person. But yeah, no, that's just very interesting. Because those types of things are bound to happen. You're bound to run into players who are gonna try to min max certain decks or play styles and everything like that. Um, but in your guys, as you release sets, do you have anything that um, do you purposely design cards that are a bit less, that have a little less going on in general, just kind of keeping new players in mind? Or do you try to balance all the cards to be easily understandable and easily?
Inherently, Genesis is not easy to understand. I'll call us out right away, just because of all the extra aspects of the game. But when we come back and like, do you make easier cards? There's a set that's called Raise, and it's just a terrible set. Everything was simplified, and essentially coming out of it, there was about 3-ish playable cards in the competitive scene. That's from a whole set. That was before I was on the team. So, and the motto at the time, and I hate this motto with a passion, this was the design team's motto. It was better to make a weak card than a broken card. That was the motto. And I actually think the motto should be the opposite. It is better to make a broken card than a weak card. Because a broken card, in testing, you should easily be able to find a broken card out. If you weak card in testing, you test it, you're like, it's fine. It's going to go through because it's fine. Because it does nothing. And you're wasting paper. You're putting it in the hands of people who are never going to play with it. It's just, there's no point of it at that point.
Right. It kind of just acts as filler at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. Because one thing that I've heard a lot is you don't want to make cards that kind of appeal to everybody. You want to make cards that people either love or hate. Either you love this card or you hate this card, because either way you're going to create fun from it. Because when players come against those cards that they hate, they're like, oh geez, here it is again, like this strategy. Versus like, when you draw that card that you really love, and you're just like, yes, like there's an attachment to it, of playing that card and doing that stuff. That, as you said before, those cards that are just kind of weak and they scrape by because they mechanically work, but they're not interesting, I think is where you get into a lot of trouble. Now, last thing I'll touch on here in terms of movement, kind of bouncing off of this idea, is, when it comes to making cards fun to play with, interesting, viable with multiple kinds of strategies, do you feel like the movement mechanics play the biggest part, or is it still a general kind of meld between movement, combat, abilities, resource cost? Is there any one thing when designing a card that takes the most important spot in terms of your consideration?
Interesting. I think I would agree. I don't think I have the most specific spot that is my interest. The biggest one for me is probably the deck building cost. Is actually the most interesting, because that's going to be the most balancing factor of it all. And I can, one of the things that I do as a designer, and I've started to show my other designers, I can take a singular card, whatever the design is. It could be like deal 1 damage. And I'll take that exact same card and I'll put it in every single possible deck building cost, which is 3 to 8. I'll put it in 3, put it in 4, put it in 5, 6, 7, 8, and I will literally throw a variation of that exact same card in every single slot. And I did this with them a couple weeks ago. We were working on a project. We were working on cards together. We were all meshing together. We came up with a design, and I said, okay, this is the design, and now I'm going to do this. And I took that exact design and just spread it out into every single different slot. And then they went, oh, wait, yeah, it's way better in this other slot. But their initial design was A. But you can spread it into different things. Just that 1 damage change makes this card so much more playable. I think movement is such a cool core of the game, but when it comes to card design, I guess it is important, but it's usually important on the back end. If I make a broken card, like a very powerful card, not broken that it breaks the game, but a very strong, let's just say a strong damaging card, I know that my opponent can just have a movement card to evade out of the way. There's already a natural balancer in the game that allows me to build these strong cards that hits them hard if they decided to evade something very weak early. That was a choice that they made. They could have saved it for my big thing. They played it early. So it is there. I don't think it's there's what I'm specifically designing, though.
Mhm. It's not the biggest factor when trying to design cards. Yeah. Even though the game itself is, you know, centered around movement and positioning and everything like that, the design of the card specifically still equally takes a lot of all these factors in mind. Yeah. Yeah, I think this says a lot about the game in general because, you would think that whatever, the main aspect of the game is what takes the most importance in design. Um, but I think in all the conversations that I've had and everything that um, no matter what the mechanic is, they all have to have like this equal say. Like if you're going to have it in your game, it has to have an equal voice. So yeah, I find that extremely fascinating. Well, so before we hop off of here, I just want to kind of give you a chance to talk about, maybe some of the things that you're working on, some of the things that Genesis has cooking, over the, soon, maybe coming out soon, or possibly anything that you're excited about with the game that you'd want to share that, people who are interested in the game or players of the game can maybe be looking forward to.
For sure. I'm going to start with the big one. Right now, we're doing a pitch contest. It is the last week of the pitch contest where players get to pitch their own cards. So right now, it's summons only. We did each card type a week each. So if you haven't looked at the game, just take a quick look at the game and you just email the pitch to alex@hauntedcastlegaming.com. And if you're pitching and you came watch the show, post something in the email. Say I'm studying from TCG Design Theory. I'll be much nicer to you.
Yeah. Well, when this episode posts, there may be a whole nother round of the pitch that may be
That's
going on.
fair.
But yeah,
Yeah, I
but
have no clue when these are going out at
yeah,
all. I don't know how podcasts work.
but hey, if you got a good enough pitch, I mean, mention the show and everything, and maybe you'll take a serious look at it. But yeah. So what else you got going on?
So obviously in Q2 we have our next set coming out. It's called Invasions. We just finished spoiling our 7 champions. I'm most excited for the art of the set. It is absolutely gorgeous. It's going to blow everybody away. If you've seen Genesis, our art's been getting better with every single set, and we just blew it out of the water with this next one coming out. And I'm going to give you a little spoiler, special TCG Design Theory spoiler. It's not a big one. It's not very fancy, but it is a change to the mat. Not less grids, not more grids, but we are adding chess grids to the mat so that it is easier to watch and stream online and understand where things are moving to.
So things like A7, B4, things like that. So what you're telling me is you're going to design cards that say, "Hey, B gets banished from the game. No more B. You can't go to B."
Now we'll be now we can do that because it's going to be officially a part of the game in the grid.
Yeah, that just gets kind of wacky. If it does happen, let me know, and I will. I'll just see kind of what's going on. I'll watch a couple games. Um, But yeah, no, that's really interesting. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, nothing for me. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So, all right. So we've been talking about positioning and movement mechanics. We've talked about how that kind of integrates into Genesis, but also other games. More specifically, positioning is a big thing. That's this widespread mechanic in games, but movement specifically of cards is something that is very new to the genre and still has a lot of room for discovery. So, um, last little bit: anything? Is there anything that you're excited about moving forward, in regards to this mechanic specifically that um, that like you kind of mentioned earlier in the podcast, just kind of is your passion? I mean, is there anything that sparks you about you know this mechanic in the game?
Sparks me about movement, just seeing beautiful movement from both sides of a board, strategically placing. It's just gorgeous. I gonna keep designing to have that happen because it's beautiful.
All right. All right, Alex, it was great to have you on the show, and I appreciate you coming on. And yeah, I just hope that the next set and the preceding sets of Genesis keep getting better and better, and forcing players to really dive into some of those strategies and some of those types of gameplay that you guys want to see.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Once again, thanks for having me. You were awesome.
Appreciate it. All right, thanks. All right, so that was Alex Miller, part of Haunted Castle Gaming and the lead designer of the Genesis Battle of Champions trading card game. And in this episode, we talked about the mechanics of movement as well as positioning. Positioning being a pretty widespread mechanic that's in a lot of trading card games, but more so movement, cards kind of moving around each other or on a board of sorts or a grid, and kind of how that factors into the design of a game. So if you're interested in Genesis, you can go to genesisbattleofchampions.com to find out more about the game. And you can also be looking forward to their Invasion set that's coming out in Q2 of 2023. So if you have any kind of interest in how games have been using positioning, or movement or anything like that, since trading card games have been a thing, you can obviously hop over to Category 1 Games. They have a huge selection of games that have either tried and been successful for a time, or maybe even tried and failed, um, but have definitely introduced very unique mechanics that have to do with card positioning, where cards are, how they interact with one another, given where they are on the board. So you can find a lot of examples of games that do those things on category1games.com. They have a huge selection of those types of games that have used those mechanics, but the game just didn't last a long time. Those are excellent ways to look at some of the games that had really good designs, within maybe a system that maybe wasn't so great. But looking at some of the things that have come before, looking at things that worked well, and implementing those moving forward. Because I think movement and position in trading card games is going to become more prevalent. And there's just so much that can be explored with that topic. So if you enjoyed the content today, or for more from the Booster Pack Network, you can visit our website at theboosterpacknetwork.com. We're also on social media: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is at TBPN Content, and we're also on Discord. If you want to hop on and talk about anything design or trading card game related, that's what we're there for. You can also message me directly at j@theboosterpacknetwork.com. I love feedback and ideas for future topics and all sorts of things, because I know I'm not thinking of every topic in trading card games. It is a very unique game design space, and so anything that can be expanded upon in that, I would love to hear about it. So again, thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the content, and we'll see you next time.